Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We are honored and delighted to welcome Professor Clark A. Pomerleau as our guest during the third of our 4 Zoom webinars in the Spring 2022 Discourses Interdisciplinary Disability Dialogues series here at Syracuse University. I feel a little bit like an announcer on an old-timey radio show right now. That's okay. We acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. I'm joining you this afternoon in respectful, accountable, and shared stewardship from my home in the unceded lands of the Cayuga and Onondaga nations in Awaga, which in English is described as Owego, New York. Discourses is hosted by the Office of Interdisciplinary Programs and Outreach at the Burton Blatt Institute, and Wordgathering, a journal of disability poetry and literature. An exciting, Stephen Kusisto is whistling and putting his thumbs in the air enthusiastically. An exciting ongoing series on disability literature, media, and the arts. Discourses focuses on critical reflection, teaching and research in today's world. After Clark's comments and our dialogue together, this afternoon's webinar participants will have the opportunity to engage and talk together, share comments and questions, and in a few minutes, I'll describe our Zoom webinar accessibility features. I'm Diane Weiner, a research professor, the Associate Director of our Office of Interdisciplinary Programs and Outreach, which is the longest title I've ever had in my life. And I'm also the lead editor of Wordgathering. I'm a genderqueer, middle-aged, white Ashkenazi Jew, woot woot. I have short-ish salt and pepper hair. I'm wearing green-framed glasses. I'm wearing a dark charcoal suit jacket over a button-down, vertically striped, rainbowy shirt and with a collar. And I'm seated in front of a maroon wall in the dining room in my home with brightly colored artwork displayed behind me. This event is free and open to the public, as all of our events are. It includes live captioning, American Sign Language interpretation, and image descriptions, as I just demonstrated. Thanks to our American Sign Language interpreters, Justin Anderson and Dave Gratzer. Thanks to Terry Slater of Empire Interpreting Service. Thanks to our live captioner, Kim Kolpak. And thanks to Doreen Radin from Caption Advantage. Special thanks as well to Steve Kusisto, Rachel Zubel-Ruggieri, both from the Office of Interdisciplinary Programs and Outreach. Professor Kusisto is our director. And thanks to Kyle James Davis from the Syracuse University College of Law's IT Services, otherwise known as Wizard Kyle. The Spring 2020 Discourses series was made possible with very special thanks to Syracuse University Libraries, our main partner in this endeavor, and also with additional support and with enormous gratitude to many co-sponsors, which I will now read slowly so that I am not going to speed up in a way that is not fun for people's accessibility experiences. And we want to respect the pacing for our sign language interpreters and our captioner, of course, who are serving us today. So we received additional support from 21 co-sponsors, including an anonymous, but not to me, but I'm never going to tell you, a faculty member who was so devoted to this series that they took money out of their research funds to donate to the cause, which I thought was very generous. And Stephen and I are very grateful, as everyone on the team is. So that anonymous faculty member, thank you, you know who you are, and the Center on Disability and Inclusion, the Central New York Humanities Corridor Health Humanities Working Group on Medicine, Disease, Disability, and Culture, the Consortium for Culture and Medicine, Cultural Foundations of Education, the Departments of Biology, English, History, and Women's and Gender Studies, the Disability Cultural Center, Disability Studies, the Graduate School, Hendricks Chapel, Information Technology Services, the Intergroup Dialogue Program, La Casita Cultural Center, the LGBTQ Resource Center, LGBTQ Studies, the Renee Crown University Honors Program, the School of Education, and last but certainly not least, and none is least, the Syracuse University Humanities Center. Copies of Clark's oral history text, Califia Women, Feminist Education Against Sexism, Classism, and Racism, and his poetry chapbook, Better Living Through Cats, are both available for purchase at a discount via the Syracuse University campus store. A link will be provided in the Zoom chat and also emailed to all registered webinar participants. I want to thank our friend and colleague, Karen Spencer, from the SU campus store, otherwise known by some as the bookstore, in part of the store, for her spirited collaboration and assistance, and our engagement together is always very much appreciated. Some Zoom accessibility specifics, which are fairly detailed but important to us and central to the mission of this office and our devotion to inclusion and accessibility by doing it, we hope. First, the chat function that permits folks to write to and chat with everyone will be quote unquote disabled, meaning inactive, during Clark's comments and during the dialogue between Clark and myself. However, messages can be sent to and read by folks designated as hosts and panelists throughout that period of time. If you have any concerns whatsoever with access or any other concerns, please do feel free to send a chat message using the chat function, and a member of our team will respond to you as soon as we can make that happen. We'll do our very best to address any concerns you might have. Also, as mentioned, throughout the webinar, we will have American Sign Language interpretation and live captioning provided on screen. You can quote unquote pin the interpreters using Zoom by selecting that option in the interpreters or other Zoom frames, depending on whom you like to pin. And you can do that on screen in various ways as you choose. Please note that we will be using the gallery view throughout. And so what that means is that in this case, Clark, whichever of our two wonderful ASL interpreters is actively interpreting, myself and Professor Stephen Kusisto will be on screen during this webinar for those of you accessing us visually. A transcript of the live captioning will also be available throughout the event. You can enable subtitles by clicking on the live transcript button, often but not always at the bottom of a Zoom window, and you would select Show Subtitles from the drop-down menu. If you would prefer to view a full transcript in a side panel next to the meeting window on Zoom, you can select View Full Transcript from that same menu. Participants are also welcome to access a stream text link provided in the chat, which gives you the option to access the captions with different adjustable font options. Should any visual content be shared, it will be accompanied by image descriptions, including a description of a person communicating in the case of myself and with Clark Pomerleau, who will describe himself momentarily. During the discussion component of our event, if you want to ask a question or make a comment, please use the Q&A feature, which includes the option for you to remain anonymous. You can also use the chat function, which we will turn on or enable. Again, I didn't make up these words, this is what they're called, to be able to interact with the participants. During this part of the event, that will be an option for you. If for whatever reasons, perhaps the Q&A feature or chat function are not accessible for you, you can use the raise hand feature. Someone really someday is going to write an article about these idioms in Zoom, and I will continue and explain further. If you want to use the raise hand feature as a preferred mode of communication, we will, in that instance, turn on your mic and video momentarily so you can ask a question or make your comment. We will do our very best to respond to as many people as possible given our limited time. Once the chat function has been made available to our participants, please do keep in mind to use it only when it's truly necessary, because depending on how different people access content via Zoom and the type of equipment people use, sometimes it's the case that a chat function that isn't able to be easily minimized on a screen has the potential to block access to certain features and accessibility components, including captioning. Intermittently, that can happen. This event is being recorded. An accessible video recording will be posted publicly once available with an accompanying transcript and a number of additional resources of interest to our participants. And now I am delighted and thrilled to introduce our distinguished guest, Professor Clark A. Pomerleau, whom I just learned is the recipient, very recently learned, the recipient of the Marilyn Morris Award for Outstanding Academic Contributions to LGBTQ Studies at the University of North Texas via the Women and Gender Studies program. And that's an enormous accomplishment, and I'm very proud of him.
Thank you. Ask me about heteronormativity, since I don't get to talk about queers today.
We will. We're going to be sure to do that. Don't you worry, friend. So Clark A. Pomerleau is an associate professor and the associate chairperson of the history department at the University of North Texas in Denton. His scholarship analyzes social justice alternatives to mainstream US society and includes the critically acclaimed book, Califia Women, Feminist Education Against Sexism, Classism, and Racism, which was published in 2013 by the University of Texas Press, as well as chapters and articles, numerous, on LGBTQ plus history, feminist praxis, and trans inclusion, as well as a biography and process about, I think I'm going to pronounce this not right, if not, you'll help me, Clark, Helen and Scott Nearing, yay, and Helen's spiritual and practical role in the Back-to-the-Land Movement. And the book is entitled, or the manuscript in process is entitled, A Consecrated Life in Her Times. Clark also publishes wonderful poetry, including the chapbook, Better Living Through Cats, one of the best titles of all time, published by Finishing Line Press in 2021. And some of the poetry that he writes about tackles depression and anxiety. And recently he was notified excitedly, and I am too, about the forthcoming publication of a full-length poetry collection about growing up and growing into elder care. And that book is called Every Day They Become Part of Him, also from Finishing Line, and that will be published in 2023. Clark's most recent awards, in addition to the one I mentioned a few moments ago, include the 2021 Faculty Research Leave he received from the University of North Texas, and also a 2020 University of North Texas President's Council Service Award. And he's also been nominated for Outstanding Accessible Online Teaching. There you go. Please join me in welcoming enthusiastically and with glee my best friend, Professor Clark A. Pomerleau, to Syracuse University via Zoom. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. I will mute my mic now, but leave myself on screen visually.
Wow, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. So I'm Clark Pomerleau. I use he, him pronouns, and I look like a clean-shaven white guy in my 40s with a very short crew cut who's wearing a green and white checked Oxford shirt. I am sitting in front of my bookcase, which has lots of books, but also quite a bit of art and the covers of books. So I'm coming here to you from Spokane, Washington. And that is part of 3 million acres of unceded land that 4 bands of the Spokane tribe steward as their sacred homeland. My gratitude goes to past through emerging knowledge from the Spokane people, and I acknowledge the impacts of colonization and the process Spokane people are engaging in to retain language and culture. I also want to thank Diane Weiner, Steve Chrysostos, Rachel, Kyle, our ASL interpreters today, Justin and David, and also our captioner, Kim. You all have an enormous job putting this together, and every time I come as an audience member, it is just fantastic. So, should I start my actual talk?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Thank you. This is Diane saying thank you to Clark. Back to you, Clark.
All right. So in relation to environmental history, a long-standing American ideal is to use land and Earth's resources to produce one's own food and something for sale. Calls for Americans to homestead appeared in the 1860s as in urban industrial capitalism and civil war were disrupting yeoman farming and plantation slavery. The 1862 Homestead Act first furthered westward colonization against indigenous peoples, and from then on, going quote unquote back to the land has been a lure in periods of unrest. From a disability studies perspective, it seems obvious that calls for homesteading have been ableist. Economic subsistence for profit from gardening, farming, or livestock management have required high executive function to plan and organize people's very heavy physical labor. Scholars have already assessed the claims that white, middle-class men without agricultural experience should leave urban problems to live off their garden and a cash crop that they sold to buy other needs. There's a lot of scholarship on how white this movement is, heterosexual it is, middle class, urban, lots on that. Focusing on disability, though, remains an underused way to analyze actual homesteading practice. The homesteading endeavor enabled liberal social contract theory in US history, which decides people's value based on their utility due to their predictable ability to engage in labor, totally ableist. Disability analysis helps us determine in what cases Americans could crip small farming and make it accessible to varying mental health and physical needs. The homesteaders I researched met the ideal of saving sufficiently to buy land and eating mostly from their garden. None covered all other costs for the rest of their lives solely through cultivating a cash crop. I'm following Jeffrey Jacobs' formative back to the land definition. He included small landholding families in which someone in the family had a full-time job, a small business, and or other source of income on or off the homestead. He did not include everyone with a garden. I highlight 5 couples in this talk: Helen and Scott Nearing, Sue and Elliot Coleman, Keith and Jean Heverin, Jerry and Jackie Bryan, and Doris Groves with Bob Jones. My historical sample found that depression and anxiety, including post-traumatic stress disorder, plus age-related changes in physicality and cognition, were the most frequent disabilities for homesteaders. These findings reflect today's prevalence in the US. Anxiety issues and major depression are the most common occurring mental health disabilities, while differences with mobility and cognition are now Americans' most frequent physical disabilities. My archival research into mid-20th century homesteading advice and practice of Helen and Scott Nearing, and oral histories of back-to-the-landers who were influenced by them since 1965, consider how actual people have been successful and unsuccessful in accommodating homestead gardening to anxiety, depression, and changes in physicality and cognition. There's more about disability and homesteading to glean, including competing ways of framing disability in relation to working the land. Today, the fourth most common so-called disability involves hearing, and farmers responding to a recent survey listed hearing only second to physical mobility as their most frequent disabilities. Due to deaf community, small and capital D, that formed through the deaf schools, deaf farmers were early proponents of agricultural fields of work. They pointed out that farming was a better route to economic success and health than low-paying city jobs to which society confined most deaf people. In the 19-teens, they rightly recognized that being deaf was in no way disabling. Today's deaf farmers have simply swapped out lights for sound-based alarms on tractors and other modern technology. Most 21st century discussions of gardening, health, along with disability, though, excludes this original focus on producing crops as most of the household's livelihood. Instead, today's texts link gardening to disability with therapeutic rehabilitation models. They encourage gardening to maintain happiness, get moderate exercise, practice motor skills, communication, social skills. They focus on redesigning with raised garden beds and modified tools, wheelchair accessible pathways, textured scented plants that people can recognize without using eyesight. So I am not talking about gardening as purely rehabilitative. And I'm not going to talk about deafness because there are all these successful deaf farmers and they could maintain normative ways regarding homesteading. So a section on emotional variation and that comes from stress and trauma. Anxiety and depression could sap energy for back to the land work. But homesteading could provide a reprieve from conditions that exacerbated PTSD. Helen Nearing stayed on the land despite so-called nerves and melancholy. She was helped by decreasing her workload and by infusions of money from her partner's work and inheritances. But for Sue Coleman, depression led to tragedy and leaving homesteading. Keith Heverin and Jerry Bryan used full-time and part-time gardening as part of overcoming distress from the horrors of the Vietnam War. Helen and Scott Nearing left New York City for Vermont in 1932. After 20 years building up that land and its buildings, they spent 30 years together on a farm in Maine, where Helen continued as a widow until her death in 1995. The couple became famous for their back to the land advice books, starting with her chronicle of their Vermont years. Those who read Helen and Scott Nearing's homesteading books will not find much mention of mental health challenges, but their sense of not fitting into society does coincide with Rosemary Garland Thompson's disability studies term, misfitting. Helen's archived papers make clear that those around her from her late teens through her 40s perceived her as suffering from what today might get diagnosed as anxiety and either depression or bipolar. One of her women mentors in the early 1920s used period-typical gendered criticism when she described Helen as, quote, very nervous and high-strung, end quote. Her husband listed her continued distress in the mid-1940s as, quote, melancholy fits, depression, crying spells, and the like, end quote. The men Helen was emotionally closest to characterized her as moody, swinging between energetic highs and hopeless lows. And they demanded that she suppress her depression and behave in a consistently focused, productive, and cheerful manner. And I am now really smiling in a very ironic way because I don't appreciate this. So they devalued and did not recognize how her emotional misfitting gave her potential knowledge and experience that they lacked. When Helen saw a doctor for abdominal pain, that doctor found ovarian cysts. Today, medical science connects ovarian cysts to hormonal disruptions, which could cause anxiety, depression, and fatigue. Helen continued to struggle with pain, fatigue, both frenetic energy and depression until years after ovarian surgery in her 40s. For most of the time, Helen could have been diagnosed, though. From the 1920s through the 1970s, there were relatively few successful problem-free treatments for the emotional variation that became known as anxiety, major depression, and bipolar disorder. New York City became a hotspot for popularizing Freudian psychoanalysis. Behavioral therapy tried to get patients to unlearn non-adaptive behaviors by reinforcing desirable actions. And much later, cognitive therapies of the 1960s and 1970s sought to interrupt negative thoughts and self-beliefs. Through the 1950s, doctors gave some Americans lobotomies due to the patient's desperation over their symptoms or by coercing patients. This destruction of the frontal lobe, however, often changed personalities and impaired decision-making. Electroshock therapy that induced seizures to kind of rewire the brain was another practice that introduced problems like memory loss. People used alcohol and opiates as sedatives. Then chemists developed drug therapy in the 1940s and 50s. The sedatives like Miltown and Valium appeared as treatments for anxiety and dissatisfaction. Valium became known in popular culture as mother's little helper, and feminists would criticize how overprescribed it was, saying that this was part of social control to dull women's very legitimate concerns. Doctors made Valium the most widely prescribed drug through the early 1980s, despite FDA conclusions in 1967 that both Miltown and Valium were addictive. First Lady Betty Ford admitted dependence on Valium and alcohol in 1978. And as a medical model emerged in the 1970s that mood variation was physiological, researchers developed further antidepressants to affect brain chemistry. These could also have unwanted effects. Helen, though, tried to rely on willpower and spiritual practice. So Helen was disidentified from her emotional state. She and her husband, Scott Nearing, believed that people should be able to prevent emotional distress through sufficient mental will, spiritual practice, and good habits like healthy eating, proper sleep, exercise, and listening to music. Now, there is no evidence that these holistic methods improved Helen's mood swings. Two factors that do seem to have done the most to alleviate her distress. The Nearings moved away from a homestead with a really grueling work pace, and her Cold War fears that the government would imprison her radical husband decreased over the 1960s. On their retirement homestead, they had a slower pace and a community of politically like-minded young people. I'm just shifting interpreters here. Okay, thank you. So Sue Coleman was one of these young people. She and her husband, Elliot, were the first to buy land from the Nearings. This was in Maine in 1967 for a way under market price of $2,000. They started their own organic market garden. Today, Elliot Coleman is regionally famous for his success. His eldest daughter's memoir says, quote, "Though his health and family had been broken in the process, he found his life purpose," end quote. So homesteading is physically demanding work. Couples who have succeeded recount working 12 to 16-hour days for years, clearing the land to get their shelter hand-built before winter, gathering enough seaweed for fertilizer, gathering seasoned wood for fuel, ordering their first seeds, sprouting the seeds on every flat surface they had inside, and then planting their rows, tending the crops, harvesting to get enough to keep them in food through the next winter. This is a short list compared to the unrelenting labor involved. Elliot and Sue started to carve their farm out of the woods in April of 1968 with an axe and a bow saw while they lived out of a camper. They had built their house by the first snow, and they finished the interior as December started. None of the work stopped when their first child was born in April 1969. That same week, one of the goats kidded, had babies. They had a delivery of strawberry plants, asparagus roots, fruit trees that needed planting. Elliot was also doing odd jobs for the Nearings and other neighbors to earn money. Sue nursed and watched Elliot hack out trunks of trees, and she carried baby Melissa in a cloth sling while she sawed firewood, hauled water from the spring, ground grain to bake their bread in the wood stove, prepared meals, canned, sewed new clothes, mended old ones, endlessly washed cloth diapers. The parents worked together as their daughter napped. Now, Sue and Elliot were both enthusiastic about their endeavor, but Sue just couldn't keep up the pace through 3 natural childbirths, each of which led to postpartum depression. Like the Nearings, the Colemans in the late 1960s and early 70s were vegetarians, and they were wary of Western medicine for some good reason. But while Elliot grew irritable from untreated hypothyroidism, Sue's depression and anxiety led her to withdraw. They tried to cure themselves with food rich in vitamins and minerals, to no avail. And one thing I want to point out here is that countercultural communities of the 1960s through the 1980s were rightly critical of the oppressive abuses and the profiteering within the medical industry. Mainstream psychiatry pathologized difference and sought to conform people to dominant norms. Western medicine relied on pills and invasive surgeries. Sadly, sometimes feminists, radical queers, and back-to-the-landers who rejected Western medical solutions continued to suffer with mental or physical health problems. Of those cases, one queer feminist looking back says, quote, We were making the best decisions we could at the time, but it wasn't the right decision, end quote. And I'm getting a little choked up because some really bad stuff happens here. The Colemans are a case in point. Elliot's hyperthyroidism got worse, and he kept pushing his body, really enjoying the endorphin rush of the hard work. As a mother to 3 daughters, Sue did the cooking, the housekeeping, most of the early childcare, while also trying to shoulder part of the burden of the garden work. And she desperately wanted to escape these unrelenting pressures, but she was caught up in what Jack Halberstam calls straight time. This belief in attaining maturity through heteronormative stages of marriage, children, and self-sufficiency. And when she couldn't take the pressure, she fasted her ways into blood sugar lows that kept her spacey. She further checked out with meditation, regular headstands, and some marijuana use. And the consequences were devastating. The eldest daughter characterized her father as wanting her mother, quote, to stand on her own feet and not strangle him with her need. But their marriage was dissolving. Neither could balance the rigors of making a new homestead profitable while being emotionally available to each other and their children. Melissa Coleman has written of neglect and the drowning death of her middle sister. And Sue distracted herself from grief with the same coping mechanisms she had developed that left her unfocused until she eventually fled the homesteading life. Mental health struggles were not something that the women in my study wanted to publicize. And I'm going a little off script, but frankly, they were punished more for it. The struggles remain buried in Helen's archive and in the memories of the Colemans and their neighbors until biographical research. The anxiety and mood swings that these women experienced were impediments to their sense of self and their work. And the farm work had a disabling effect on them when they couldn't find ways to make homesteading accessible. In contrast, Vietnam veterans Keith Heverin and Jerry Bryan found solace in homesteading. Unlike Helen or Sue, Keith and Jerry had enjoyed small town farm work from youth. Keith enlisted in the Navy in 1966 rather than get drafted. He married his high school sweetheart, Jean, before boot camp. Jerry went to college, was in ROTC, and became an Air Force intelligence officer in 1965. By the time Keith returned for his first R&R with his wife, she described him as, quote, jumping at every noise, his eyes darting into the dark corners of every room, acting for all the world like a hunted animal, end quote. And he told Jean about seeing a tank moments after it had hit an anti-tank mine that tore it and its crew apart. He was a telephone and electrical lineman, and he was a prime target for snipers. In 1969, after his second tour, he rigged tripwires in the house to pots and pans in the night so that Jean would, quote, understand what it was like over there, having to watch every step, unquote. And 35 years later, Keith reported to me that he had nightmares for a long time about how he narrowly missed being blown up with other men in his unit. Now, back in 1970, Keith took early release rather than be separated from Jean again for a tour in Antarctica. He felt alienated from the anti-war college students and like he was suffocating in the densely populated Rhode Island. Jean said, quote, he was moody, unfocused, mad at the world, unquote. His first escape was killing fish with a deep sea crew. Then Keith and Jean read the 1970 reissuing of Helen and Scott Nearing's Living the Good Life. Jean recalled that Keith's, quote, ready enthusiasm for the idea was a welcome change from his bouts of depression and restlessness. They saved up and bought land in Maine directly from the Nearings in early 1972. The Nearings judged this 6 foot tall, 4-inch, clean cut, strapping man with a crew cut, and the respectful, quiet wife a solid bet. Buying property cheap from them created a homestead that turned Keith's life around. After 7 months, Keith and Jean spent clearing the land and building a cabin. Jean remembered, quote, gone was the post-Vietnam breediness. Gone was his frustration of not fitting back into civilization. He had found his niche. He was happy. Again, we see a case where someone experiencing disability as no longer fitting into society. Jean felt like she had her man back. And of course, ending there is too simplistic. The Heverons had serious marital problems that led to divorce. Despite his efforts not to be like his abusive father, Keith's adult children cut him out of their life for many years. But in comparison with other options, homesteading gave Keith the literal space to facilitate recovering from Vietnam War PTSD plus childhood abuse and neglect. And because he was so physically powerful, he could do the regular labor and carve out a niche in the community as a butcher. Jerry Bryan's route to homesteading was less direct. After setting up B-52 bombing operations in Guam and serving as intelligence in Saigon, he had seen enough to want to put behind him a war he found out of control with greed, mayhem, pain, suffering. He noted in 2015 how his voice shook while talking with me about his wartime experience. For Jerry, meeting Jackie after the war in New Orleans infused new hope. He and his love of his life became teachers in San Francisco because he had loved that city between deployments, and she wanted to scrub the South from her identity. But when their daughter Heather was 4, they wanted to raise her somewhere else, somewhere more rural, and they took jobs in Bangor, Maine in 1972. They saved up and bought a farmhouse for $13,000 near friends who had land. They spent the next 19 years teaching, trading labor for helping people, and renovating their home. And they found community in the Unitarian Church, which Jerry recalled, quote, was bristling with back-to-the-landers. We were out there every weekend helping somebody do something. That's what we were doing. And our kid was raised there and everyone was barefoot running around, end quote. And it was a good life, from which they retired to Brooksville, Maine, where Helen Nearing was. So Keith and Jerry are just 2 of the Vietnam veterans of the 1970s who used rural organic subsistence farming or market gardening to rehabilitate themselves. Because it was organic, they were regenerating the land in the service of agricultural cultivation. And in turn, they were affecting human and non-human ecosystems. I think for the sake of time, I'm going to kind of skip a little bit of my analysis of that because I want to get to a shorter section on age-related physical and cognitive changes. In the back to the land realm, most people who started homesteading did not consider themselves disabled, much less proudly Crip, in that contemporary disability justice sense. Back to the land organic growers have often promoted their organic produce as the alternative to toxic factory farming. One moment. Because organic farmers believe that organic food is crucial to building and maintaining a healthy body, some of them propose that people can individually safeguard themselves from illness through clean eating. The Nearings and the Colemans were among many who have argued that diet maintains the energy needed to farm and actually prevents or cures disease. I don't believe this myself, and I find it super problematic because it ends up blaming the victim when they have cancer or hypothyroidism or any other thing. So I'm on record here. This is a bad belief system, but it is a prevalent one in that crowd. So when changes to physicality are due to aging, those who want to stay on the land often scale back their production, and they find ways to get others to help with the physical work. Helen Nearing homesteaded from age 28 to her death at 91. She and her husband, Scott, had three main tactics for accommodating their aging bodies: slower paced work on an already established homestead, hiring people, and free labor. Scott's original experience before he knew Helen was to break new ground and build a tiny home. As a couple in his middle age, though, they bought an already inhabited farmhouse on land that had been farmed for decades. Now, their ableism would have prevented them from perceiving themselves as cripping time, but what they did was they turned away from intensive cash crop marketing to the use of inheritances and publishing on their own schedule. The Nearings enjoyed much of the outdoor labor that they did, and they could do it without hurry or worry. Helen and Scott planted a 100 square foot garden and then took 14 years in spare moments to build a stone wall around it. This was their sport and recreation. There are some other examples of that. But throughout their lives, they also hired help with their cash crops, and they jobbed out big tasks like carpentry or truck repair. After they gained renown as models for going back to the soil with their book, Living the Good Life, they increasingly put the stream of admiring visitors to work on small tasks. Together with the Colemans and the Hevrons, the Nearings coordinated apprentices through the 1970s. They traded their expertise and food for the apprentices' labor. More recently, Doris Grove and her husband, Bob Jones, have retired from elder care and insurance sales, respectively, that supplemented their homestead gardening. They continue to make an income renting 4 rooms on their property when those are not filled by interns, apprentices, basically, who are supplementing their gardening labor. Doris and Bob have found a niche market as vegan organic farmers, and their interns spend 3 to 5 hours per day, 5 days a week, working in return for room and board. And they get these practical skills that Doris and Bob can teach them. When Jerry and Jackie retired to the coast in Brooksville, Maine, they fixed up the cottage they bought, they started a new garden, and they built a workshop barn. As Jackie was wiring the barn for electricity, she kept losing her tools. It was their first sign of Alzheimer's in 1998. And because the Bryans had retirement savings from their teaching careers, rather than worry about food production, Jerry and their friends entered what scholars call and caregivers experience as, quote, dementia time. They prioritized collective care and fostering relationship in the moment as they devoted their energy to Jackie's well-being. They helped Jackie continue to garden, which Jerry said, quote, kept her really as awake and aware and energized as you can be with Alzheimer's, unquote. Jerry created daily routines like driving and playing with their Labrador retriever. Their lab went everywhere with them, and their dog would repeatedly invite Jackie into his goal of living in the moment, throwing and retrieving his ball in a continuous loop. Jerry fondly recalled that they, quote, built a community around the garden and cooking and people coming over, end quote. Jerry entered Jackie's situated reality. When friends left for the night and Jackie said she wanted to go home, she was already at home, he would get her coat and they would walk out their door, stroll for a bit, and come back in. Now, many of the organic farmers I interviewed and researched who remain connected to the land are in their late 60s and older. They contend with aging bodies that can't not labor as strenuously as they did in their youth. Some tenaciously cling to beliefs that clean living will keep them healthy enough to continue. But as a group, they exhibit rising age-related infirmities. People's recognition that able-bodiedness is temporary can really undermine their sense of themselves and their, quote, usefulness, and it can affect their interpersonal relations among those who have prioritized physical prowess and productivity. And this physical prowess productivity model, part of that social contract in normative society, is very embedded in the homesteading movement with obvious ableist problems to that. So the homesteaders presented here, nonetheless, fit into a larger eco-ability framework, ecological ability framework that asks us to reject measuring humans, non-human animals, and the environment's worth based on how they yield profits. Eco-ability points out how the social construction of normalcy as economic productivity is rooted in social control and oppression. Oppression that is against disabled humans, against non-human animals, against ecosystems. The mainstream view is that non-human animals and the ecology lack rights and exist at least partly for the use of humans. And this justifies profits from raising animals for slaughter and poisoning the planet to maximize crop growth. The American capitalist ideal of individual self-sufficiency also tends to categorize some humans as disabled burdens on society, which has profoundly excluded disabled people from American life. In contrast, eco-ability values interdependence, inclusion, and respect for difference within community that includes all life. And I think that is the way forward, if there's any way forward with the homesteading movement. So thank you for listening to my research. I hope this generates questions and comments from you that we can discuss.
Thank you so much. Steve is applauding. I'm applauding here in different ways. And I have, this is Diane on camera again and speaking. And I just want to thank you for those wonderful reflections. And of course, I've read some of this work because of my fortunate association with you in a personal realm as well as professionally. And I'm so excited about this book and its appearance in the world in multiple formats that will be helpful to people globally.
Thank you.
I was thinking, thank you. I was thinking about a few things before we transition to some of the questions I know that you know I was going to ask you. And one of the things I was struck by, to use that idiom, in listening to you is the three different kinds of time that you described. Jack Halberstam's concept of straight time and what some people have referred to, I don't know specific scholars, but perhaps you can help us with that around dementia time. And of course, what many people in this audience would know about in terms of crip time. And Rachel Zubel-Ruggieri and I recently learned from a book by Petra Kuppers that the origins of the term crip time are much older than a lot of academics would, with respect, have us believe, and actually goes back probably to the mid-1980s when a person with cerebral palsy who typed to communicate, and also used communication boards, more specifically, sometimes referred to as facilitated communication, which I know is a controversial subject. I'm okay with saying that out loud. That Anne MacDonald is the reason we have the term crip time. And this is a very interesting idea, given that I ignorantly thought it was someone else over the years and several other people. So straight time and crip time and dementia time are kind of forming this hologram of a Venn diagram hologram, I guess, in my head. And I was also thinking about the things you said about echoability and the concept of situated reality, which I think interfaces so profoundly with disability studies and people's devotion to the activist commitment to inclusion. People oftentimes talk about inclusion, but to practically make it come to fruition is a very different process. And I think you've made that very transparent in your comments.
Thank you. I on the dementia time, I've just put in the chat to everyone, so hopefully it goes to the audience too, that term comes from Haley Yoshizaki Gibbons' dissertation from 2020. And I would argue that it is a concept that people who are loving and caring for people with dementia are very, very familiar with,
Yes.
But she gets credit for the term.
Well, that's great. And it says here in the chat, thanks so much, Clark. The title of the dissertation is Time and Again, and it's from 2020. And it was realized by this wonderful scholar, Haley Yoshizaki Gibbons at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Thank you for that. Certainly dementia time is something I know about indeed. So
it's very, it comes from crip time and queer time. Like those are foundations for the development of a concept of dementia.
Got it. Thank you. That's really, I want to read more about that. Thank you so much. And just a couple of other reflections and one clarification. I think I'm remembering correctly that with the Coleman's middle child who died by drowning, that was, of course, an accident. And so we want to make sure everybody knows that
yes.
That was a completely accidental, in case people are unfamiliar with that story. And I guess the last thing I'll say before I ask you a few questions, and then we'll open it up for everybody. We have more than half an hour, and I know Steve Kusisto also has some reflections I'm looking forward to hearing about at the end with us. But in a way, people who are engaged in the academic study of echoability, I think, spend a lot of time thinking about space, of course, and cultural geography. But what is meaningful to me so much, and what you do as an oral historian with so much expertise at storying and the sharing of experience of other people respectfully and with affirmation, is the human geography of the cultural geography. And that's really it. Listening to you talk about it is different than reading it textually. And I know that having it interpreted and made available with a transcript and captions will make it available to lots of different people. So I'm very grateful for all of that. So how did you first become, I know the answer, but I want other people to know. How did you first become interested in Helen Nearing's life, Clark? And in a related way, when did you first think about Helen's life trajectory, if I can use Helen's first name as well, as being connected with echo-crip sensibilities?
Yeah. So after I published Califia Women, I was thinking about a second project, a book project. And I'm an oral historian, so that was my mindset. Califia Women is about feminists creating diversity training in the context of them living in Southern California, especially Los Angeles, through San Diego. So they were very, very urban, even though they were taking week-long or weekend retreats to Girl Scout camps and things like that. And so there's a very urban history component to Califia Women. And I was thinking, well, rural history is so underdone nowadays, and especially in oral history way that I am interested in. What would alternatives to mainstream society, which is what I'm really very interested in, look like in that rural setting? And the Back to the Land movement was one possibility. So let me pause a sec. I think we want some ASL interpreter shifting. Thank you. Okay, so now I'm like, I want the Back to the Land movement. That's too big. So I want a case study. Where? A long story, I end up going to Maine. And part of going to Maine was very much that the Nearings had moved there, become much more famous over the 70s, ended up with this community of baby boomers who visited them, bought land from them, stayed in the area after apprenticing. Like there's this huge, still today, group of people. And so that took me to the Nearing's homestead, which is now a nonprofit called the Good Life Center. It's a wonderful place. And I'm seeing all their books, and I'm learning about where her archive is that she painstakingly decided what to put in. And I'm finding out she was a lifelong theosophist. What is the Theosophical Society? I come out of a history of religion background too. So now I'm like, what is all this? This is like amazing. I do women's history, you know, like first and foremost, the people who people my history have tended to be women. And so I knew there were two biographies of Scott, and he's very important. But there was a biography of Helen too, but there was just so much more that could be done there. And to go to your echo ability question, Helen and Scott Nearing are incredibly problematic figures for talking about disability, much less echo ability, because they are not on board. You know, they had a spiritual mindset, kind of like Christian Science, that really believed that you imagine and think and enact your reality. And if anything goes wrong with you, then that's your fault. So that's like out. You obviously, that's like a non-starter for any disability, anything around justice. And yet that view continues in various forms. And so that is what kept my interest about her, even though I of course cannot support them on that.
Well, thanks so much for that very reflective answer. And I mean, I know you and I have spoken for years about we didn't have a content warning for this talk, but obviously we're talking about some very heavy stuff, and that's okay. And I hope everybody's on board.
Steve has a question or a comment.
Steve, did you want to say something?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Zoom is so blind unfriendly.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Listening to this train of thought, obviously, as with any good talk, many things come up, for the listener. And having been a disabled teen who was put in a psychiatric institution and having struggled throughout my life with structural ableism and believing profoundly that living an unburdened, crip utopian response to the structural obstacles is clearly the way to go. Your talk has opened up a couple of really interesting observations, at least for me. I hope you find them so. One is good old Thoreau, right? Everyone here probably knows the famous quote, right? The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. What is called resignation is confirmed desperation. From the desperate city, you go into the desperate country and have to console yourself with the bravery of minks and muskrats. A stereotyped but unconscious despair is concealed even under what are called the games and amusements of mankind. There is no play in them, for this comes after work, but it is a characteristic of wisdom not to do desperate things. So that's a very famous Thoreauvian quote, right? And I think for me, what emerges from your talk and from the scholarship you've done is the sort of Ouroboros, or the circling irony of the fact that looking for liberation in the country, they find more desperation. The very desperation that Thoreau says we ought to throw off, right? And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because that seems to me to be the tragedy of the thing, right?
Mhm. Yeah, and I mean, these are case studies, and there are so many more stories out there that I don't have access to,
Right,
partly, of
sure.
course, because our society condemns our talking about depression and anxiety and bipolar and any other mental health issues. But I think that it is really noticeable, and I think there's something to it, that the women in my study who were suffering from mental health distresses did not get support and affirmation for that
That's right.
in the way that the men did. And there's a gender normativity here, but there's also a gender normativity to the physicality of the homesteading, which it just so happens 2 out of 3 of the men I focused more attention on were very, very physically, had a lot of physical power.
Yeah.
You know, so Keith Heverin and Jerry Bryan, both of whom went into the military, who had PTSD, who had very successful post-military lives in terms of feeling like they were part of community, doing what they wanted to do. Like they had the kind of, not utopia for sure, but something that worked for them. And it was based on physical ableism, which worked for them, right? But obviously is not going to work for everyone. Elliot Coleman was an athlete throughout his life. He's the one who got hyperthyroidism. He's not a large person, but he was a very, very physically adept, I guess, person. But the hyperthyroidism really put a wrench in his path to success. Nonetheless, he has succeeded by those standards of that community. Whereas Helen, while she would consider her life a success, certainly suffered. And frankly, I'm not the only scholar. I'm one of at least 3 scholars who firmly believe that the reason she put in her archive what she put in her archive was because she couldn't write about and publish about her suffering, but she wanted it to be known. And Sue Coleman didn't have that type of luxury. You know, she has this mediated through her daughter's memoir. And I find that's an excellent memoir. It's a New York Times seller. And it's really hard on the mother and really forgiving on the father. And I find that just very interesting. Because to me,
Yeah, you know, some of this reminds me a little bit of that canonical Scandinavian immigrant book, Giants in the Earth, the Rolvag book about that first generation of homesteaders in Nebraska who've come from Norway. And one of the more compelling elements of that book is its treatment of the slow mental decline of the primary homesteader's wife, who simply loses her mind, what with weevils and tornadoes and pestilence and dying children. And, you know, what did you say, 16 hours a day of labor, only to see it all washed away, right? The terrible irony is that there's a fantasy that going back to the land is somehow Edenic, when in fact it is probably the most grueling thing a human being could imagine doing.
Absolutely.
And,
there's this strong myth of independence and self-sufficiency, which is baloney.
Baloney.
To not use a harsher word, you know, and the whole frontier thesis that is a 19th century historical phenomenon, which is also baloney, is predicated on this idea of this self-sufficiency, when really what creates those communities out west, whether that's the Midwest or west of the Mississippi, is forming community. And a lot of it is women forming community.
Correct.
Forming churches, forming schools, forming mutual aid societies.
That's right.
And so,
And
it-
many
it-
Scandinavian
yeah.
women played a powerful role
Oh,
in
yeah.
building the co-op movement.
yes, yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just love this conversation, and we do have a question from someone in our Zoom audience, but
Great.
thanks so much, Steve, for those great reflections, and thanks, Clark, for all of that wonderful interaction with Steve. And one of the things I have to say is I read Giants in the Earth. I think I was 15 years old, and it was one of the books that this curriculum required when I was in high school. And
It's a killer book.
it's like 7,000 pages long. It's almost like it's like Leon Uris's Exodus, for Scandinavian back to the landers. And so I wonder about what it would be like to read that again. So now I'm wondering about that. But I want to go to Emily Pfeiffer's question here, which
great
is
question.
thanks so much, Emily. So Emily says, thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Pomerleau. I'm a graduate student and would love to learn more about your oral history methods and about some of the tensions or challenges that may have come up as you pursued that method. I'm especially interested in the move from listening to someone's story and then applying academic and activist frameworks that person would not use themselves, as you describe coming up against in your project. I'm fascinated by oral history methods and hope to one day take them up, but this is the sort of question/tension that I find difficult to negotiate and would greatly appreciate your perspective. Thank you.
Wonderful question. Thank you for that question. So I don't get to keep that question, I guess. It went away. But anyway, okay, so to answer your question that I now can't see anymore. Yeah, oral history.
If you go to, I'm sorry for interjecting, if you go to answered.
Oh, I can, here's my scroll down. Great, I'm back. Okay.
Sorry
Thank you.
about that.
So yes, I studied oral history with an oral history specialist. And that's, of course, what I recommend. But there are some great books out there, some kind of how-to books. There are a lot of community oral history projects, especially in the queer and trans communities, that have done great work getting these stories that otherwise would be lost. And I think one of the big selling points of oral history is that it can let us reach people who might not otherwise really get into the historical record very deeply. And it can let us ask questions that often are not what gets talked about. So from a disability perspective, of course, having an attention to mental health and physical disability as people tell their stories. So you were talking about the tensions coming up in listening to a story and applying frameworks. I think the first part of oral history is inviting people to tell their life history and then tell their open-ended question answers for whatever the project is, the focus of the project. And then thinking about not so much the factual truth of dates and names and that kind of thing. That's not what oral history is good at. What oral history is really good at is the meaning that people attach to what has happened to them. And so there, again, you're really listening to the person. What meaning does this person attach? What is the significance to them? And I think it is important to, put that forward. And sometimes a historian can look like they are supporting something that we consider kind of heinous because they have put forward the story of what this person's sense of significance is that we don't agree with. So that's where then I get to your point about applying other frameworks. We are always, as people today, going to be asking questions and thinking about what's important to us today, even if we're looking at the past. And that's why we keep having history, because there are always new questions. And so I think for me, it's worthwhile to kind of signal clearly that no, this person would not agree with the analysis I'm doing. The Nearings would not agree with me cripping anything, valuing disability at all, any of that. But I do value these things, and so I'm going to do it anyway. And, you know, I'll just be really upfront and say that this does go against their ideals. In other cases, what I'm saying does not go against ideals as much. You know, like the two men with PTSD, they spoke to that in their interview with me. And the other stories that I have not shared stories about people who are alive unless either they told me themselves, knowing that this was a recorded interview that would be transcribed, or these stories have been already published. Helen Nearing's different because she is not alive anymore. So, you know, I'm using her archive. So that's some of what I do. And it really depends. You know, I was trained by a feminist oral historian, and so I'm more willing to do things like make people anonymous, like a sociologist would. A lot of oral history professionals won't do that because they, you know, the part of the idea is that we're creating a record. We're co-creating a record. I hope that helps.
What a great question. What a wonderful
Yeah.
reply. And Emily doesn't know this, but one of the questions, but you do, that I was going to ask was actually about what is oral history in relation to this project. And Emily said, yes, thank you so much. Hooray. So I'll ask a little bit more in this trajectory, if that's okay, Clark.
Sure.
So I had initially planned on asking you, you know, for folks who may not be familiar with oral history, what is it, and what does such a critical practice offer in terms of our archiving, uncovering, and understanding disability histories?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of taking Emily's great question in a slightly different but related space, to use the word space again.
Yeah.
And that would be great if you could reflect on that for a moment.
Sure.
And then other questions and comments. Thank you.
So what I haven't said so far is that one of the things that distinguishes oral history from something like journalism is that keeping the record, keeping an archive of these interviews. So whereas a journalist might interview Steve and ask him a bunch of questions and then come up with an article with some neat quotations, but you can't access what that interview looked like, what the context was in which Steve said any of that. You know, you're just left with the journalist's article, which is in itself a different kind of awesomeness, but that's not oral history. So oral history, you have to archive these interviews. Ideally, you do a type of life history where before you get to your whatever your project is, like your projects on homesteading, you ask the person some open-ended questions about their life. So I did that with all of my interviewees. So I've got these discussions about when and where people were born, what their family looked like, what their schooling looked like. Did they go to public school or private school? What did they like to do as kids? How did they like school? What did they think they were going to do after school? Blah, blah, blah. None of that in and of itself is anything to do with disability or homesteading. And it might or might not be able to be mined for that. But where oral history then, so why do we do that? Because later scholars and later people accessing these histories will have different questions. And they might want to look at correlations around public schooling or whatever, place, geography. Who knows? I don't know what people will know and want in the future, and that's why I'm trying to give them a little more. But then you have your own project, in this case, homesteading, going back to the land, and you're asking questions specific to that. And sometimes you can get at things like disability a little bit circuitously in terms of asking about the workload and how that felt, and what was it like for their bodies and how were they feeling, and then you may or may not get what you were thinking you might get, but you might get something interesting that they weren't necessarily focused on in their lives. One last point, I find, and I'm not alone, that in oral history that we have our stories that we tell a lot, and then we have other things where we haven't really storied them. And so if you interview someone and you ask them something where they can plug in one of their stories they've told 20 times, you're going to get this qualitatively different answer that's very narratively like tidy. And if you ask something that the person hasn't really thought about, you're going to get a very different type of answer that can be really interestingly revealing because they haven't had time to tidy it up. So good luck.
Well, I love a meaningful mess, and I think one of the things that's really riveting about reflecting on this, and of course I'm biased because of my history with you over many years, is I think about part of your work as being around engagement and rapport building. So some of these questions also are obvious, this, of course, they're inviting someone to be connected in a way that there's an establishing of trust or an establishment of trust in order to embark upon the rest of the conversation. And it's so open and so interesting. And I've, just really appreciated that. We have a little bit
I want to say just a second on that, because that is super important. Oral history as a profession has a code of ethics, and you are not supposed to be messing over your interviewees. You are supposed to be co-creating, and you are supposed to be respecting this person and actually like connecting with this person. And so, this is why when I say my research instead of writing it, I get choked up because I care about these people. I care about Helen, and I don't even agree with Helen about quite a few things. But yeah, I will start actually crying thinking about her distress over her decades of life, because it's just, she's a human being. And part of that code of ethics is always the people first aspect of that connection.
Which is so consistent with so much of disability justice work and the concept of, or the axiom, nothing about us without us, and presuming competence and the co-creation of narrative and interdependence and all of these themes and commitments. So someday maybe we'll have even more content about how many different, what do I want to say, overlaps there are between these different commitments. And I know Steve has some closing remarks, but I have a question here. I'll make one more quick comment, which I'm not going to ask you as a question because we A, don't have time, and B, it's just too gigantic, as you and I know about this. And so I'll put out to the audience, and for the record, I guess, no pun intended exactly, in this recording, that I wonder what it would be like to have an accessible back to the land movement. And I wonder what it would be like in practice to have that be real for a multiplicity of people across a broad variety of experience and meaning making, as some might put it. So Rebecca Garden has a question and a comment here. I will leave this in the Q&A under open. So I'm sorry before that I shifted that into answered live so that it's not confusing. I'll just leave it here open. And then when you're done, we'll pause and have Steve out make some closing brief remarks. So Rebecca, thanks for being here. Rebecca's a dear friend and a colleague here in upstate New York, professor at Upstate Medical University. And Rebecca says, thank you for this wonderful and important research and critical intervention. Is there a role for this research as an intervention in the present? In other words, have you talked to people involved in quote unquote greenhorn farming now, or research their experiences to see if these forms of ableism are reproducing themselves in the most recent wave of homesteading. Thanks, Rebecca. You're muted, Clark.
Sorry.
No worries.
Yes and no. So I just put in the chat to everyone Valerie Padilla-Carroll's book that's coming out with the University of Nebraska Press in September of this year. And of course, now I can't remember the name of the book, but one of the things that she does is she really looks at homesteading over the century plus to today. And she's especially interested in how people of color first had difficulty accessing homesteading and nonetheless have persevered to access homesteading, how queer people have been able to access homesteading, how are young people getting into homesteading. And so in terms of Rebecca's question, I have done a little bit of interviewing of people who went back to the land much later, like the 90s or the 2000s. And the small sample size that I have, it's hard to know whether it is generalizable, but these people certainly have been much more connected to ideas around racial equality and class equality and opportunities and equity for people of varying sexual orientations. There's still a physical ability ableism. And I'm not really sure how we bridge that gap between the kind of gardening as rehabilitation therapeutic, that it doesn't have any necessarily need to produce, compared to a homesteading movement that has been focused on that production. But that said, one of the things that is very, very, very common is that people are not having their entire life be they're working on the farm trying to produce food, that they are doing other things too. And that dual or multiple roles, I think, does leave more wiggle room for variation in physical and mental health ability.
That's very helpful. And thanks so much for that great question, Rebecca. And I just wanted to say, some folks are asking about recordings. And so I've put in the chat here, but I also want to say out loud, so it will be in the captioning and transcript and also interpreted, that the recordings for this series, including this conversation and wonderful presentation by Professor Pomerleau, will be posted on our website. And everyone who registered will also get a link to this recording once it's available. But we will publicly make those accessible to everyone with, as I said, accompanying resources. So Steve, did you want to close us out? Or maybe we have one. Oh, thank you. Fascinating response, Rebecca said. Appreciate that, Rebecca. Steve, did you want to make some closing thoughts shared for all of us, or share some closing thoughts, excuse me?
Thank you, Diane, and thank you, Clark, and thanks to everyone who has tuned in today, and to those who may tune in the future when we have this up on our website. It's my hope that we at Syracuse University will be able to continue this kind of rich and nuanced, and I think really quite engaged interdisciplinary thinking about disability in the public sphere in the coming years. I'm actively engaged in looking for ways to find the funding to, continue what we're doing. Obviously, an event like this one today is just a great, it's really a great signpost to the kinds of things that we've been hoping to promote and to achieve. I think that when you look at disability from the perspective of, ethnographic study or literary analysis or, the history of medicine, whatever sort of set of interesting intersecting lenses one trains on disability, you find that it's everywhere once you start looking, right? So that you drive past a meadow and you realize somebody there was disabled 200 years ago. Those rocks cover up that spot, right? And I had a pretty strong feeling as we headed into today's talk that we would again experience that kind of remarkable uncovering of the architectonics and complexity of disability. And I want to thank Clark for helping us see that again and to think collectively and singularly about what these things mean. And this was a real delight. And thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Please, Clark, go ahead.
Oh, just thank you to everyone. This is a delight for me to engage with everyone here.
Well, thank you very much, Clark, and thanks, Steve. And we're getting comments in the chat thanking you, of course. And I want to personally and professionally thank you also. What a meaningful and powerful afternoon we're having here. And we're going to turn off the recording now. And thank you, everyone, for coming. And we wish you a peaceful afternoon.